Colonel Jamal Washington pulled up to the U.S.-Mexico border checkpoint in El Paso, Texas at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, driving his personal vehicle, a modest black Ford F-150 pickup truck, returning from a family emergency in Juarez where his uncle had passed away, and as he handed his U.S. passport through the window to the young white border patrol agent whose name tag read, "Agent Miller." He watched the agent's expression change from routine boredom to instant suspicion the moment he saw Jamal's face. Jamal, a 47-year-old African-American career military officer with 25 years of distinguished service, 2 Bronze Stars and command of over 3,000 soldiers at Fort Bliss just 30 miles away, was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple black polo shirt, khaki cargo pants, and work boots, because he'd been attending a funeral, grieving with family, and hadn't wanted to draw attention by wearing his uniform to a personal, painful occasion. But Agent Miller didn't see a decorated colonel, didn't see a man who'd dedicated his entire adult life to protecting American borders and American freedom. All Miller saw was a black man driving a pickup truck with Texas plates at a border crossing. And in his prejudiced mind, that equation automatically added up to suspicion, to probable cause, to someone who needed to be questioned, searched, and scrutinized. Miller held the passport up to the light, examining it far longer than necessary, his blue eyes narrowing, and then he said with barely concealed contempt, "Mr. Washington, can you tell me the purpose of your visit to Mexico?" Jamal, exhausted from grief and a sleepless night sitting with family, kept his voice level and professional the way 25 years of military discipline had trained him. "I was visiting family for a funeral, as I mentioned when I handed you my documents." Miller's lip curled slightly. "Uh-huh, and how long were you in Mexico?" Jamal responded. 4 days. Miller wrote something on his tablet, taking his time, making Jamal wait in that deliberate way that border agents use to establish power, to make you feel like you're being evaluated, like your citizenship is conditional, like you're guilty until you prove otherwise. Behind Jamal's truck, other vehicles were lining up, engines idling in the hot Texas sun, drivers getting impatient, and Jamal could see in his rearview mirror a white family in a minivan being waved through the adjacent lane after barely a 2-minute interaction. No extensive questions, no suspicious glares, just a routine welcome home and a smile. Miller looked at his computer screen, then back at Jamal and said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to pull over to secondary inspection," pointing to a separate area where vehicles were directed for additional screening. Jamal felt his jaw tighten because he knew exactly what this was. He'd seen it happen to countless people of color at checkpoints, airports, traffic stops across America, the arbitrary decision that someone looks like they might be hiding something, might be lying, might be a threat, all based on nothing but the color of their skin and an agent's personal bias masquerading as security protocol. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to Axiom USA for more powerful stories of justice and resilience," Jamal said carefully, keeping his frustration controlled. "Agent Miller, can you tell me what the reason is for secondary inspection?" "I've provided all required documentation, answered your questions. I'm a U.S. citizen returning home." Miller's response was cold. Clipped, rehearsed. "Sir, I don't need a reason. Secondary screening is at my discretion. Now please pull your vehicle to the designated area or you'll be refusing a lawful order." The implicit threat hung in the air. Comply or face arrest. Submit or be criminalized, accept this injustice, or have your life turned upside down by charges of obstruction. Jamal could have revealed his rank right then, could have mentioned that he commanded the very military base that provided security support to this border checkpoint, could have pulled out his military ID and watched Miller's attitude transform. But something in him resisted that impulse because why should he need to leverage his rank to receive the basic dignity and respect that should be afforded to every American citizen, regardless of status or position? He pulled his truck into the secondary inspection area, a concrete pad with a large metal canopy where 3 other vehicles sat, a beat-up sedan with a Hispanic family looking exhausted and worried, an older Toyota with a young black man sitting on the curb, with his hands visible while agents searched his car. and a work van with Middle Eastern writing on the side being practically dismantled by border agents pulling out tools and equipment. All people of color, all subjected to enhanced scrutiny, all experiencing what Jamal was experiencing. The presumption of guilt, the burden of proving innocence, the exhausting reality of being non-white in America's security apparatus. 2 more agents approached Jamal's truck. A white woman named Agent Foster and a Latino man named Agent Torres, and Foster took the lead, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Sir, please step out of your vehicle, leave your keys in the ignition, and stand over there," pointing to a spot away from the truck. Jamal complied, moving slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible because he knew how quickly these situations could turn deadly when officers claimed they felt threatened by movements they interpreted as suspicious. Torres began searching the truck's cab while Foster ran Jamal's passport through additional database checks, and Miller stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching Jamal with undisguised hostility, like he was already certain of criminality and just needed to find the evidence to prove it. Foster looked up from her computer. "Mr. Washington, have you ever been arrested?" Jamal responded, "No, I have not." Foster continued, "Have you transported any goods, currency, or merchandise from Mexico?" Jamal said, "No, just personal belongings." Foster pressed, "Are you sure? No gifts, no items for other people, no packages you were asked to carry?" The implication was clear. She was suggesting he might be a drug mule, a smuggler, a criminal courier, and Jamal felt the weight of stereotype crushing down on him. The assumption that a black man at a border must be involved in something illicit, must be hiding something, must be lying about his innocent explanation. Torres called out from the truck, "Got some duffel bags back here? Want me to search them?" Foster nodded, and Torres pulled out Jamal's funeral clothes. A black suit, dress shoes, a tie, along with sympathy cards, a framed photo of his late uncle, and personal toiletries. Torres held up the suit, examining it like it might be evidence of a crime, and Foster asked, "What's with the formal clothes?" Jamal's voice cracked slightly with emotion he was struggling to contain. "I told Agent Miller I was attending my uncle's funeral. Those are my funeral clothes." Foster's expression didn't soften. "Uh-huh, and you went all the way to Mexico for a funeral?" The question was loaded with skepticism, with the implicit suggestion that his grief wasn't real, that his family emergency was a cover story, that black people don't have legitimate reasons to travel internationally, only suspicious ones. Jamal took a deep breath, fighting back tears of frustration and sorrow because he was being forced to justify his uncle's death. To prove his grief was legitimate, to defend the simple act of being a nephew who loved his family and crossed a border to say goodbye. If you're feeling the weight of this injustice, hit that like button and share this story to spread awareness. Axiom USA brings you stories that matter. Another vehicle pulled into secondary inspection, and Jamal glanced over to see a white couple in an expensive SUV, and he watched as agents approached them with smiles, with courtesy, with questions asked in friendly tones rather than accusatory ones, and within 10 minutes that couple was cleared and sent on their way with apologetic explanations about random security protocols, while Jamal had been standing in the sun for 35 minutes being treated like a criminal. Torres continued searching every compartment of the truck, pulling out the floor mats, checking under the seats, opening the glove box and sorting through registration papers and tire pressure gauges, looking for something, anything, to justify the detention, to validate Miller's suspicion, to prove that the racial profiling was warranted. Foster asked more questions. "Where do you work, Mr. Washington?" Jamal responded simply, "I work at Fort Bliss." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" Jamal said, "I'm in the military." Foster nodded slowly, writing notes. "Active duty?" Jamal confirmed, "Yes." Foster continued, "What rank?" And here was the moment. Jamal could say colonel and likely end this humiliation immediately, or he could say nothing and see how far this injustice would be pushed, how thoroughly he would be degraded before someone recognized the absurdity. He chose the latter, responding simply, "I'd rather not discuss my work details at a public checkpoint." Foster's eyes narrowed, interpreting his discretion as evasiveness, as suspicious, as confirming her bias. "Sir, If you're active military, that's relevant information for clearing you through this checkpoint. Jamal met her gaze steadily. My citizenship status is confirmed by my passport. My military service is my private business unless you have specific... They were deciding how much further to push this, how much more they could justify detaining him, how far they could take their power trip before it became legally indefensible. Miller walked back over, his chest puffed up with authority. Mr. Washington, we have reason to believe you may be transporting contraband. So we're going to conduct a thorough vehicle search, which may take 1 to 2 hours. And if you refuse to cooperate, we'll detain you for obstruction. The threat was clear. The choice was an illusion. Submit to extended harassment or be arrested. Accept this violation or have your life destroyed. Comply with racial profiling or face criminal charges. Jamal felt something shift inside him, a lifetime of swallowing indignities and maintaining composure reaching a breaking point, not with violence or rage, but with a quiet decision that this injustice would not go unchallenged, that this moment mattered not just for him, but for every person of color who'd been subjected to this same dehumanizing treatment at America's borders, airports, and checkpoints. He pulled out his phone slowly, keeping it visible so no agent could claim they felt threatened, and he said clearly, "I'm calling my command." Miller stepped forward aggressively. "Sir, put the phone away. You're not permitted to make calls during an active inspection." Jamal didn't put the phone away. "Actually, I am permitted to contact my chain of command if I'm being detained without cause, which is what's happening here." Miller reached for his own radio. "We have a non-compliant subject in secondary inspection. Requesting supervisor and possible backup. Want to see how this ends? Subscribe to Axiom USA right now so you never miss stories of courage and justice that need to be told." Jamal dialed a number while agents watched him warily, and when someone answered, he said calmly but firmly, "This is Colonel Jamal Washington, ID number 598432. I'm currently being detained at the El Paso border checkpoint for secondary inspection without stated cause. I'm requesting immediate contact with the checkpoint supervisor and notification to Fort Bliss Command that one of their officers is being unlawfully held." The words landed like grenades. Miller's face went pale. Foster's eyes widened. Torres, who'd been searching the truck, straightened up and stared. The other agents nearby stopped what they were doing and looked over with expressions of confusion and dawning horror. Miller stammered, "Wait, did you say Colonel?" Jamal ended his call and turned to face Miller directly, his voice still controlled but carrying unmistakable authority. "Yes, Agent Miller, Colonel Jamal Washington, commanding officer of the 5th Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment at Fort Bliss, which, as you may know, provides security cooperation and support to this very border checkpoint." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the desert wind, the idling engines, the crackle of radios, but no human voices because every agent within earshot had frozen in shock. Foster found her voice first. "Sir, why didn't you identify yourself as a military officer when you first arrived?" Jamal's response was measured but cutting. "Because I'm a U.S. citizen with a valid passport, and my rank shouldn't determine whether I receive basic dignity and lawful treatment at my own country's border. I watched a white family get waved through in 2 minutes, while I've been detained for 40 minutes and subjected to invasive searches and accusatory questions, all without any legitimate security concern, only because of how I look." Torres quietly closed the truck's tailgate and stepped back, his expression showing shame and discomfort because, unlike Miller and Foster, he understood exactly what had happened here: racial profiling disguised as security protocol, bias masquerading as discretion, racism hiding behind badges and authority. Miller tried to recover, his voice shaking slightly. "Colonel Washington, sir, this was just standard screening, nothing personal. We conduct random secondary inspections," Jamal interrupted, his decades of command presence now fully evident. "Agent Miller, this was not random. Random would mean a proportional selection across all demographics. What I observed in 30 minutes was every vehicle sent to secondary being driven by people of color, while white travelers were processed quickly and courteously. That's not random, that's profiling." Foster attempted damage control. "Sir, we apologize for any misunderstanding. You're cleared to proceed. We just need you to sign." Jamal held up a hand. "I'm not signing anything until I speak with your supervisor. and I will be filing a formal complaint with Customs and Border Protection Internal Affairs. Because what happened here today is a violation of civil rights and an abuse of authority." A supervisor arrived, a middle-aged white man named Supervisor Keller, who'd been radioed about the situation and was already in full apology mode. "Colonel Washington, sir, I am deeply sorry for this incident." "There's clearly been a misunderstanding." Jamal cut through the diplomatic language. "Supervisor Keller, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was racial profiling. Your agent Miller saw my face and immediately assumed criminality. I was singled out for extended screening without cause, questioned about my legitimate travel, searched invasively, and threatened with detention when I questioned the basis for my treatment. Meanwhile, white travelers passed through with minimal interaction. That's not security work, that's discrimination." Keller nodded rapidly, sweat visible on his forehead despite the checkpoint's air conditioning. "Yes, sir, I understand, and I assure you this will be investigated thoroughly. These agents will face appropriate consequences." Jamal's voice carried the weight of command. "I want more than consequences for these individuals. I want systemic review of profiling practices at this checkpoint. I want data on secondary screening demographics. I want mandatory anti-bias training for all personnel. And I want accountability measures that ensure this doesn't happen to the next black or brown person who crosses this border lawfully." Keller agreed to everything, knowing that a formal complaint from a military colonel with 25 years of service and command of thousands of soldiers would bring scrutiny that could end careers and trigger federal investigations. Miller stood to the side, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. His face a mixture of fear and humiliation as he watched his supervisor grovel before the man he'd treated with such contempt 40 minutes earlier. Foster and Torres kept their distance, knowing they'd participated in a moment that would define their careers and not in a positive way. Other border agents whispered among themselves, some looking ashamed, some defensive, all recognizing that a reckoning was beginning. If this story is hitting home, make sure you're subscribed to Axiom USA and turn on notifications. We share powerful, true stories that shine light on injustice and celebrate those who fight back. A military police vehicle from Fort Bliss arrived within 20 minutes, and 2 MPs, 1 black woman, 1 white man, stepped out and saluted Colonel Washington. Their presence a powerful visual reminder that this man commanded respect, authority, and loyalty from subordinates who understood his character and capabilities. The MPs were professional, but clearly upset on their colonel's behalf. And the white MP said loud enough for the border agents to hear, "Sir, the base commander has been notified and is contacting CBP regional headquarters directly about this incident." The black woman MP added, "Colonel, we're here to escort you back to base. Your command team is waiting to debrief and provide any support you need." Jamal thanked them, then turned back to Supervisor Keller. "I'll be expecting a full report on your internal investigation within 2 weeks, and I'll be coordinating with my JAG office to ensure proper legal follow-through." Keller nodded, knowing he had no choice but to comply because the alternative was federal scrutiny that would expose whatever systemic problems were hiding beneath the surface of his checkpoint's operations. Jamal got back in his truck, which Torres had hastily repacked with his belongings after the search, though nothing was organized the way it had been, and his funeral suit was now wrinkled from careless handling. He drove through the checkpoint with the MPs following behind him in their military vehicle, and as he passed the other lanes, he saw the young black man who'd been searched still sitting on the curb, waiting for agents to finish tearing apart his car. And their eyes met for a brief moment. Recognition, solidarity, shared experience of being targeted for skin color rather than actual security risk. That young man didn't have a rank to pull out, didn't have command authority to invoke, didn't have military police to call for backup, and Jamal's heart ached for him, even as he felt grateful for his own resources to fight back. The story spread quickly through both military and Border Patrol networks. By that evening, CNN had picked up the story. Fort Bliss colonel detained and racially profiled at border checkpoint. By the next morning, congressional representatives were calling for investigations. By the end of the week, 3 agents, including Miller, had been suspended pending review, and Customs and Border. Protection Headquarters had announced mandatory anti-bias training and data collection protocols for all border checkpoints to identify and address discriminatory patterns in secondary screening selections. Jamal gave interviews to multiple news outlets, and in every interview he made the same point. I was fortunate to have rank and resources to fight back, but I'm one case among millions of Black and brown Americans who face racial profiling at borders, airports, traffic stops, and everyday interactions with authority. The system that empowered Agent Miller to detain me without cause is the same system that results in disproportionate searches, arrests, and violence against communities of color. My rank made my case visible, but it shouldn't require exceptional status to receive constitutional rights and human dignity. Agent Miller was ultimately terminated after the investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory secondary screening, recommendations that statistically targeted people of color at rates far exceeding random selection. Foster received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining but kept her position. Torres, who'd shown visible discomfort during the incident and cooperated fully with investigators, received counseling but no formal discipline, and he later reached out to Jamal privately to apologize and explain that he'd felt pressured to go along with Miller's bias to avoid being seen as disloyal to fellow agents, a confession that highlighted how institutional racism perpetuates itself through peer pressure and career concerns that silence those who might otherwise object. Supervisor Keller was transferred to a non-supervisory position, and the El Paso checkpoint implemented new protocols requiring documented justification for secondary screening selections and quarterly demographic audits to identify potential profiling patterns. These changes weren't perfect, systemic reform never is, but they represented concrete steps toward accountability that Jamal's refusal to stay silent had catalyzed. 3 months after the incident, Jamal was invited to speak at a Border Patrol training academy about implicit bias and the importance of treating every person crossing American borders with dignity regardless of appearance. And he stood before 200 border agents in training and said, "When you see someone at your checkpoint, you're making split-second judgments based on appearance, behavior, documentation, but I challenge you to examine what assumptions underlie those judgments. When you see a black face, a brown face, do you see potential threat or fellow American? When you see casual clothes and an older vehicle, do you see possible criminality or economic reality? Your job is security, but security doesn't mean suspecting everyone who doesn't look like you. It means using actual evidence, actual behavior, actual risk indicators rather than stereotypes and bias." Some agents in that audience looked uncomfortable, some defensive, but many nodded and listened intently, and several approached him afterward to thank him for speaking truth and to share their own struggles with prejudiced colleagues and supervisors who punished agents for not going along with discriminatory practices. The family that Jamal had attended the funeral for reached out to him when they heard about his border checkpoint ordeal. And his aunt, his late uncle's widow, told him through tears, "Your uncle would be so proud of you, not just for being a colonel, but for standing up for what's right, for not letting them make you small, for fighting back with dignity and truth." Those words meant more to Jamal than any military commendation, because they connected his professional authority to his personal values, his rank to his character, his power to his principles. The young black man, whose car had been searched that same day at secondary inspection, saw the news coverage and contacted Jamal through social media to thank him for bringing attention to what happened, revealing that agents had detained him for 3 hours. Completely dismantled his car looking for drugs that didn't exist, damaged his vehicle in the process, and then released him with no apology and no offer to repair the damage their search had caused, all because he was a 22-year-old black college student driving an older car, and agents assumed he must be transporting contraband. Jamal helped connect that young man with legal resources and advocates. And while the young man ultimately chose not to pursue formal complaints out of fear of retaliation, his story exemplified what Jamal already knew, that for every high-profile case of racial profiling that gets media attention, there are thousands of invisible cases where victims lack the resources, platform, or energy to fight back. And justice depends not just on individual courage, but on systemic change that protects the powerless without requiring them to be powerful. Colonel Washington continued his military service, continued to command with distinction, and continued to use his platform to advocate for racial justice both within the military and in broader society. He spoke at diversity conferences, testified before congressional committees about discriminatory practices in border security, and mentored young black officers navigating the challenges of serving in institutions that sometimes treated them as threats rather than assets. And every time he crossed a border, every time he went through a checkpoint or security screening, he thought about Agent Miller's face when rank was revealed, and he felt both satisfaction that accountability had been enforced and sadness that it took revealing exceptional status to receive basic respect, a dual reality that millions of black Americans navigate daily, knowing that their humanity shouldn't require credentials but often does, and fighting to create a world where that's no longer true. The moral of Jamal's story is complex, yes? His rank gave him leverage to fight back and create consequences that might deter future discrimination. But the deeper truth is that racial profiling doesn't care about rank, education, accomplishments, or character. It operates on the crude logic of skin color and stereotype. And dismantling it requires constant resistance from those with platforms and power, constant solidarity with those without, and constant refusal to accept that this is just how things are. Miller's termination was justice, but justice for one incident doesn't erase the thousands of daily injustices that go unchallenged, unseen, unaddressed. Jamal's courage to speak up mattered. His willingness to endure discomfort and risk his privacy for public accountability mattered. But his story also reminds us that the burden of fighting racism shouldn't fall only on its victims, white allies. Institutional leaders, policymakers all have roles to play in creating systems where racial profiling is impossible, where bias is identified and addressed before it harms people, where dignity is default rather than privilege. And until that world exists, stories like Jamal's will continue to matter. Voices speaking truth to power will continue to be essential, and the fight for justice will continue to require both individual courage and collective commitment. Thanks for watching Axiom USA, where we share stories that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. Share and subscribe for more powerful narratives that need to be heard. And drop a comment telling us your thoughts on Colonel Washington's experience and how we can all work together to end racial profiling at our borders and beyond.